Hi, I'm Alex Udris, and thanks for joining us tonight for Boldmethod IFR. We're going to talk about lost communications procedures. It's kind of a favorite check ride topic for everybody on their IFR instrument rating check ride. It shows back up sometimes if you have an IPC with an instructor, but for a lot of us, after you get your instrument rating, you're done taking check rides, you don't really think about it that much. And that's because in today's airplanes, IFR lost comm, it's a pretty rare scenario. Most aircraft are equipped with multiple radios, and you've got a couple different electrical supplies. You've got your alternator and you've got your battery. So the chances of losing total communications, that's fairly thin. Though it's actually happened to me, not in IFR, but in VFR before, and so it's absolutely a topic worth visiting. So tonight we're going to start out by looking at the rule itself. We're going to talk about lost communications and essentially the step downs that we're going to do. We're going to talk about a little bit why this would happen and whether or not lost comm is an emergency or not. And then we're going to take a look at a scenario of a flight from Rocky Mountain Metro down to Santa Fe. And we're going to take a look at an actual route clearance. We're going to go through the flight, and we're going to talk about what would happen if we lost comm in each one of those stages. And from there, if we have time, we'll take a look at a couple different RNAV arrival procedures that you start to see in the professional flight turbine operation environment. And we'll talk about how those would be flown if you were flying lost comm. Okay, so let's start by taking a look at lost comm itself. And when we think about instrument flying, if you have a reasonable amount of instrument time, what you'll probably know is most of the flight happens in VMC. And so when you think about that, you're usually climbing through or descending through an IMC layer. We rarely stick in it unless you're sitting in the northwest coast, maybe in the fall, winter, or spring, where there's a lot of rain and there's a lot of clouds. Most of us are passing through IMC on our way to or from an airport. So we're typically not in the clouds continuously. And so that brings us to the very first part, and that is, if you're lost comm in VFR, if the failure occurs in VFR conditions, or if VFR conditions are encountered after the failure, each pilot shall continue the flight under VFR and land as soon as practicable, which basically means as soon as it's practical for you to get the airplane onto the ground. So this brings up a few questions. First of all, they use the word VFR and not VMC. But really what they mean is if you enter visual meteorological conditions, and you can continue in visual meteorological conditions to land at a safe airport, then you should do that. And the reason is, first of all, it's safer for you, but it's also less of an impact and safer on the national airspace system. Because when you're lost comm, ATC needs to move aircraft out of your way. And when we take a look at the lost comm regs, essentially they were written for both radar and non-radar environments. And so they cover this wide gamut, and they do not always create a very efficient or possibly even most safe way to get your aircraft on the ground. But it's assuming that ATC may not be able to see you, and there could be other aircraft in the area. So what the FAA is saying is, hey, if you end up in visual conditions and you can get the aircraft down to a safe airport in visual conditions, do that. It's better for you, and it's better for everybody else. Okay, how do they know what's happening? Well, hopefully you're squawking 7600. And so once you lose comm, squawk 7600, they see you start to deviate from your route. The assumption is you're either going somewhere or you're in good weather and you're going to try to divert and land. The other thing to clarify here, people ask, well, what happens if I'm in Class A airspace? And in the AIM, the FAA says same thing. If you're in Class A airspace, even though that's an IFR only area, if you're in VMC, they still want you to continue visually and land at another airport. Now, they also give you a caveat. The airport that you choose is entirely up to you. It needs to be safe. So that means don't land somewhere where maybe you're not authorized. If you're flying for an airline or for a professional pilot, 135, at an airport that's not allowed in your op specs, they're not pushing you to do that. They're saying, don't land somewhere where you feel it's unsafe, you don't have the required equipment. Don't land somewhere that's just minutes short of your destination. If it's only going to save you 5 minutes and you are already set up to land at your destination, the FAA gives you leeway. Okay, so let's take a look at the next part. We talk about route, lost comm routing. okay, there's essentially 4 different options. And number 1, you're going to follow the route assigned in the last ATC clearance received. Okay, if you don't have an assigned route, we'll get to vectored in a second. You're going to follow whatever route ATC has asked you to expect or told you to expect in a further clearance. And finally, if they've never told you to expect anything, you're going to follow your filed route in your flight plan. And then the situation for vectoring. Typically during departure or on approach, ATC will start vectoring the aircraft. And if they are vectoring you and you lose comm, you're going to take a direct route from the point of radio failure to the fix, route, or airway specified in the vector clearance. We're going to get into this in detail in a second. But when we start to think about radar vectors in the IFR environment, especially when you're flying cross country, when ATC gives you radar vectors, they always tell you why and what they're vectoring you for. And so essentially, like when we're coming in on the arrival, we just flew the Thompson arrival in from San Francisco a couple days ago. And as we're coming in on the Thompson arrival, they vectored us off. Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta, turn left heading, I think we're 080, radar vectors for the visual approach, okay, or radar vectors for the approach. So what they're telling us right there is both we can plan, okay, they're taking us off, they're going to put us on the approach, so we know what's happening next, but also so that if we were to lose communication, we have an idea of where ATC wants us to go. And the same thing is true on departure. And they may say Cirrus 216 Bravo, let's say we take off of Rocky Mount Metro, they say Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta, turn right heading 350, radar vectors for Lufsea. What they're saying is they're going to send us north, but ultimately they're giving us radar vectors for Lufsea or radar vectors for Victor 389. That's the route that they're going to get us to. So if we were to lose comm, that's where they want us to go. Okay, let's take a look at the altitude side. When we look at altitude, it's the highest of either your minimum en route altitude, the altitude that ATC has assigned you, or the altitude that they have advised you should expect. Now, when we look at MEA, one of the questions people say is if I'm arriving at a fix and I'm below the MEA but above the MOCA or the obstacle clearance altitude, can I stay at the MOCA? And the answer is yes. If you're within 22 nautical miles of the facility and ATC has put you down to the MOCA, then that is essentially a suitable minimum en route altitude heading into the facility. On the other hand, if you're going away from the facility, if you're joining onto the route as opposed to arriving in from it, the MOCA would only be valid until you reach 22 nautical miles, and then you would need to climb. And in case any of you have any questions, the FAA doesn't specify in regs or in the AIM whether GPS-equipped aircraft can treat the MOCA as a safe MEA for the entire route in a lost comm failure. Again, these regs really were put together before GPS and RNAV became kind of the de facto way of traveling everywhere. And so now, with GPS, you could safely travel an airway at the MOCA the entire time, because the MOCA does guarantee obstruction clearance along the entire airway, but it only guarantees radio nav-aid reception within 22 nautical miles or 25 statute miles. So somebody might ask the question, could I call the MOCA the MEA if I'm using GPS? The regs don't address it, the AIM doesn't address it, and my general preference, I'll usually take the higher. I would take the MEA, give myself more room. Okay, and then finally, the clearance limit. So the question to ask yourself, once you're done flying, we're going to take a look at an example of this, once you reach the end of your flight plan, or where they've cleared you to, the clearance limit, is this a fix from which an approach begins? If the answer is yes, you'll start your descent and your approach as close as possible to the expect for the clearance time if they've given you one, or if one hasn't been received, as close as possible to the ETA, your estimated time of arrival, based off of your filed or amended estimated time en route. When we talk about amended estimated time en route, we mean amended with ATC. So you've changed your time en route, and you tell ATC, our new estimated time en route is X. So this brings up something. It's not the ETA in your flight plan that you might have gotten from ForeFlight when you ran your navlog, and it says, oh, you planned to depart at noon and you're going to arrive at 2, your ETA is at 2. it's your estimated time en route, because you oftentimes don't leave, it's your estimated time of departure. And this brings up one funny thing about instrument flying. A lot of instrument pilots don't ever bother noting the time that they actually take off. But if you lose comm, that's pretty important, because that's going to tell you when your ETA is. You take your your ETA is. You take your time of departure, actual time of departure, and add your estimated time en route. So that's something that I do. I note it down on the scratch pad, essentially once I taxi onto the runway. And at that point in time, I'm ready to go. Okay, if it is not, that is a wrong tool. If it is not a fix from which an approach begins, leave the clearance limit at the expect further clearance time, or once you arrive over the clearance limit. Proceed to a fix from which an approach begins and commence descent and approach as close as possible to the estimated time of arrival, calculating that based off of your filed or amended with ATC estimated time en route. And this one's interesting. Simply, and we're going to look at this in several different practical examples. But when I learned to fly, we always filed to a nav aid. Okay, if I was going to Rocky Mountain Metro, I would never file to the airport. I would file to the Rocky Mountain or Jeffco VOR. And there are procedures that have feeder routes from the Jeffco VOR. So I could go from the VOR along a published route in lost comm and fly a procedure. But now, and at one point in time, instructors said, do not file to airports. Do not request direct to the airport. Always choose a nav aid. Now, even if you don't simply, I'm guessing that I just answered a question there. Now
you did, yeah. We had the question like just came up, and I put it up there, and it was just to roll it off here. Actually, I'll just put it up on the screen.
That's good, because if there's, go for it.
Okay, so let me just read it off here. So the question is, when you file an IFR flight plan, do you recommend filing to an IAF of the approach you expect to fly at your destination, or just to the destination airport? And lost comms, is one going to be better than the other?
Okay, so first of all, to answer that, the reality is this: no matter what you file to, ATC is going to amend your route generally in your favor. And so if you've flown quite a few IFR cross countries, you'll discover that typically we're issued a departure procedure, which includes a whole bunch of legs. Once we're up and over terrain, usually the mountains west of us, we're given direct to a fix, then direct to another fix, and then no matter what I file to, whether it's a VOR or an RNAV fix at the beginning of an approach, ATC helps me out by saying, Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta, direct to destination. Okay, that happened over western Utah. We're going into San Carlos. Direct to San Carlos. Okay, now that's going to take us over San Jose and a million other places, but they give us that so that we can get moving there as quickly as possible. And then as we ended up over the Cascades, Oakland Center came on and said, hey, Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta, I got amendments to your routing. Advise when you're ready to copy. And I said, okay, we're ready to copy. And they spit off Modesto plus 2 fixes that I had never heard of. And now that was my new route to get me into San Carlos. Okay, so the way to look at that is this. If you're doing short cross countries, especially during training, and ATC knows that you're doing training, oftentimes they won't amend your route because they're figuring that you want to fly exactly what you filed. But as you start flying out there in the IFR world, you're going to get direct to destination or direct to this all of the time. And at times I said, hey, do you want to go into the, like they'll say, direct to Hayden. And I'll say, the VOR or the airport? And oftentimes center will come back and say, do you want to go to the VOR? And I'll say, no, the airport's fine. So the reality is it better to file to an initial approach fix to make lost comm easier? No, because there's an easy way to get yourself to initial approach fix, even if the route doesn't end at an initial approach fix. You can easily get yourself to one, especially with RNAV, which would be why you're given direct routing. And so because of that, it really doesn't add much workload. And finally, you're complicating a lot of flights, possibly, just because the off chance that your radios may fail. And that's something, again, to think about. The reason two-way radio failures are such a big deal is they honestly don't happen anymore. And so we're going to talk about that. And actually, this is a good time to introduce it. The FAA says, hey, all of these rules, okay, we want you to follow them. But if this is an emergency, these rules may not really suit the scenario. Again, these rules are developed so that if you're in a radar or a non-radar environment, ATC can safely separate you from other aircraft. But the reality is, if you have a two-way radio failure, chances are you have a much larger problem. Okay, so let's talk about that practically. Whether you're flying a 172 or a Cirrus SR-22, whether the 172 is from 1980 or the 22 is from 2019, or you're flying a transport category airplane. Typically, we have multiple comm units on the airplane. Okay, so you've got a comm 1 and an independent comm 2. If both of those two units go out, what's gone wrong? Well, usually the antennas are mounted separately. So it's not like one of your antennas got taken out and it knocked out all of your radios. If that happened, you've probably hit something anyways. If both of your radios go out, chances are you have an electrical failure. That's the most common reason to lose communication. And in fact, when I had an electrical failure, it was in VFR. What had happened is we had pulled the landing gear up in a Piper Arrow, and the pump kept running and then shorted out. The alternator blew offline. And right at that moment, I had picked up the transmit on the practice area frequency, and the entire electrical system died. And so, I had transmitted, and then everything went dead. And so one of the things that I say is, when we're talking about all these lost comm rules, if you really have lost both of your radios, unless you can firmly identify that you still have complete nav reception, the airplane is totally fine, nothing else is going to go wrong, chances are you're actually in a fairly serious emergency and you need to get the airplane on the ground. And in that case, the FAA says you can do whatever you need to do to conduct the flight safely. So that does not mean continue through icing conditions for 2 hours all the way to your destination. It does not mean fly halfway across the United States, because that's the route that ATC has given you. It means look and use your resources. Also keep this in mind. If you call an air traffic controller and you're in a radar environment, as soon as ATC notices that you've gone lost comm, they're going to clear people out of your way, both laterally and above and below you. And honestly, if you talk to most controllers, they'd prefer you on the ground sooner rather than later. You're less disruptive for other aircraft in the national airspace system. So, if you're lost comm holding, they're not going to put someone in a holding pattern below you. They're going to basically keep that area clear. So with that, again, the question is, while we talk about these rules, keep in mind, if your electrical system is dead, if you've got P-static or a static issue with the airplane because you're coated with ice, and you click the transmit button and all you hear is a squelch and you can't get through to anybody, yes, you're definitely lost comm. But more so, you have an aircraft emergency which might require you to deviate from these regulations. And keep in mind, as we look at these regulations, you're going to see some things that don't make a lot of sense here. And again, it's because the regulations are very simple. They're meant to cover all of the possible cases. And what the FAA says is, hey, if this is an emergency or not safe, if following these is not safe, then you have the judgment as the pilot. It is your discretion to choose what you do. Okay, one other thing I'm going to show you quickly before we dive in too far, that is mountainous terrain. You can find the longitudes both in the FARs. These are FAR designated areas. This is a picture from the AIM. You can see essentially it starts over Colorado. We're looking just kind of east of the Denver area, basically runs north-south, and then it covers the entire western part of the United States except for the Central California Valley, and then you can see the Appalachians over here. This is really important because when we talk about off-route navigation, which happens all of the time, we're usually going direct somewhere. Even when I'm given an airway, it's usually to transition me out of a busy area, and then it's direct. Airways to kind of get me out of the busy area and then direct to here, direct to wherever I want to go. And so in that case, oftentimes I have to find my own MEA. And remember, it's fairly simple. In a mountainous area, you take for that route segment, so between those two waypoints that make up your route, you're going to find the highest point within 4 nautical miles either side of your route. You're going to add 2,000 feet to that. It's not just terrain, it includes obstacles. Okay, so if we look at the non-mountainous areas, and we'll go back to the iPad, like North Dakota here in Minnesota, not a lot of mountains, but there are some 2,000-foot towers right here outside of Hillsboro. The ground's about 900 feet, but those towers are 2,000 feet tall, so if your route took you within 4 nautical miles of those towers, you'd want to be 2,000 plus 900, so you call it 2,900, at least 1,000 feet above that. So 3,900 would be the RNAV MEA for that route. And again, you know, we'll take a look at a second at how we would figure that out. The simple way is you could always look at a VFR sectional. And one of the things that I say, especially flying around mountainous terrain, I use my VFR sectional on IFR flights more than I use an IFR in-route low chart. When I'm in the flight levels, I use it just out of curiosity to see what's below me. But when I'm operating below 18,000 feet, I typically am using my VFR sectional alongside my IFR chart at the same time to see where terrain is. Okay, so let's take a look at a clearance. And this is an actual flight. In fact, if you watch the How to Find Cloud Tops in IFR, this is the clearance that we were given. We are going to Santa Fe, KSAF, Sierra Alpha Foxtrot. And they cleared us, Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta, cleared to Santa Fe Airport via the Denver 1 departure, Lufsea, Victor 389, Pueblo, as filed. Climb maintain 8,000, expect 16,000, 10 minutes after departure, 126.1, and departure 126.1, squawk 3722. Okay, so this as filed from Pueblo, then we went to the Cimarron, CIM, and from there we went to KSAF. Okay, so that's our route. Denver 1, Lufsea, Victor 389, Pueblo, then Cimarron, and KSAF. So let's actually take a look at that. And to do that, I'm going to switch over to ForeFlight. So here's our route. The Denver 1 departure, if we look at the plates, that's the Tishner arrival, here we go, is a radar departure procedure. You can see it right here. So it does not have any specific routing. We were departing runways 30 right. So the procedure is climb right turn to assigned altitude and heading between 350 clockwise to 113 from departure end of runway, radar vectors to assigned route. Okay, so when we talk about this, people, if you've never flown one of these procedures, you'll look at that and you'll go, wait, what do you mean there's kind of a group of headings? Which heading do I fly? Essentially what they're saying is Tower is going to assign you a heading between 350 and 113 degrees. You're going to turn right to join that heading. Now again, Tower will normally say the same thing. They'll say Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta, on departure, right turn, fly heading 090, clear for takeoff, runway 30 right. So the Denver 1 departure is a radar departure procedure. And if we look at it, there is no defined route. Essentially, they're going to vector us to a point. My assumption is that's going to be the first point on my flight plan, the first point on my clearance, unless the radar departure procedure tells me otherwise. If they were to say, expect radar vectors to X. In this case, they don't say anything. So I'm expecting that it's going to take me to my first point, but once I start getting vectored by ATC, ATC will tell me where they're vectoring me to, so that I know where to go in case I lose communication. We're going to look at this in more detail here in a second, but let's go back to the map. So essentially, coming out of Rocky Mountain Metro, we're going to get radar vectors to Lufsea. Lufsea is the fix that you can see right here. We're going to join Victor 389. Victor 389 is going to take me south to Pueblo. From Pueblo, my as-filed route takes me down to the Cimarron VOR. At that point in time, we're going to cross the Sangre de Cristo Range and head into Santa Fe. So, if we were to pull up an IFR chart, we could take a look at some of these minimum en route altitudes. One thing I love about ForeFlight is it makes it very easy to see what they are. This first segment between Lufsea and Adane, my minimum en route altitude is 9,000 feet. Between Adane and Drake, it's again 9,000 feet. Between Drake and Pueblo, it lowers to 7,600 feet. And then from Pueblo all the way to Gossip, 8,700 feet. Then it climbs from Gossip to Cimarron. It climbs up to 11,000 feet with a MOCA of 10,200 feet. You'll notice there's a minimum crossing altitude for Victor 83 and Victor 210 if we're going southwestbound. So if you're to look at that, southwestbound is going to carry us this way. This is Victor 83 210. The minimum crossing altitude is 1,400 feet southwestbound. However,
14,000.
or 14,000. Thank you, 14,000 feet southwestbound. But since we're on Victor, in this case 611, that doesn't apply. And then, if we were to use this section here to try to figure out what your MEA is, you're going to be missing some information. So we could switch over to the VFR sectional and basically take an 8-mile corridor, which is going to be fairly small, about yay big. You'll notice, though, that the highest point's actually pretty easy to find here. It's the top of this mountain at 13,102 feet. So this is mountainous terrain. I would add 2,000 to that, so essentially 15,102 feet. That would be my minimum in-route altitude here. There's an easy way to find this. If you go to the profile view, I set an 8 nautical mile total corridor width to match the IFR 4 miles either side. And in this case, the 14,000 feet actually is happening by Rocky Mountain Metro. So you could modify the route. What I could do is just pull out and there you can see 13,100 feet MSL is the highest terrain within 4 nautical miles either side of that route. So again, add 2,000 feet to that, 15,100 feet would be my MEA. And again, in flight I'll do that. The key thing is I always save or favorite my full route so that I can go back to it, or my current route if ATC's amended me, and then I can kind of change that route around in flight to measure altitudes, makes things a little bit easier. Okay, so that is my full route. Now let's take a look from the very beginning. If I was to suffer a comm failure, what's going to happen? So let's imagine the worst case scenario. Okay, I taxi onto the runway, get my takeoff clearance from tower, start my takeoff roll, lift off, and everything dies. Okay, so the first question is, should I come around in the pattern and land? And the answer is, if you can do so safely, that's what you should do. Okay, if I can safely maneuver around in the pattern and land, then I should absolutely fly the pattern, land the airplane. Let's say I'm in VMC, but the ceilings are 500 feet, and there is no way I'm going to be able to stay in VMC and land the airplane safely. Now I'm going to start to fly some lost comm procedures. And the first thing to take a look at is this Denver 1 departure. And on many departure procedures, you'll notice that the FAA gives you lost comm procedures. So on a Jepson chart, they're in this box that says lost comms. Let's take a look at this. If no transmissions are received within 1 minute after departure, maintained assigned heading until 7,000 MSL. Then climb to filed altitude via direct the Denver VOR, then via the assigned route. If filed altitude is above 10,000 feet, cross Denver VOR at or above 11,000. So essentially, if I was to take off, radio's fry, I can't safely return in the pattern to land, what they want me to do here is follow that assigned heading until I climb above 7,000 feet MSL, then continue that climb to my filed altitude while going direct to the Denver VOR, and then from there join my assigned route. And if my filed altitude is above 10,000, I need to cross the Denver VOR at or above 11,000 feet. Okay, so you can see the Denver VOR is pictured here in the center of this procedure. So let's take a look, jumping back into ForeFlight, and what would happen there. So in this case, the Denver VOR is right here. And so I'd fly that heading. Let's say they gave me a 350 heading. I continue flying north out of Rocky Mountain Metro, and then I would turn and join this route right here, or essentially hit direct to take me to the Denver VOR, okay, DEN. So here's the next question. If you look at what I filed 16,000 feet, and that's above 10,000 feet. So let's say it's a hot day and I can't make it to the Denver VOR until I'm at 8,000 feet by the time I get there. What am I going to do? Well, I need to cross it above, what did it say? Oop. I need to cross the Denver VOR above 11,000 feet. So in this case, I would just enter a holding pattern. And I'd keep it really, really simple. Okay, I'd hold over the Denver VOR in my inbound course, right-hand turns, 1 minute legs until I was above 1,000. And from there, I would then proceed on my filed route. And so from there, I haven't been given any route. I have no expected route. I wasn't getting radar vectors yet, but what I could do is go from Denver to Lufsee. And so now I know both that I'm climbing to my filed altitude. That's made it very easy. So I'm going up to 16,000 feet. There is nothing along this route that would require me to go higher. And at this point in time now, I'm actually at my filed altitude, which is high enough to get me all the way down to Pueblo, then over to Cimarron, and to meet the requirements to fly all the way down to Santa Fe. So honestly, if you lost your radios right after takeoff off of Metro and had to fly that lost comms, things are pretty simple. You go to Denver, hold until you're above 11,000 feet, continue that climb up to my filed altitude of 16,000 feet, go from there to Lufsee, join the rest of my route, and I don't have to worry about MEAs or any of that because I've filed an altitude that is above all of my required MEAs. It's above every single one of them. So I would just basically sit there at 16,000 feet until I get to my clearance limit. And my clearance limit in this case is Santa Fe. In a second, we'll take a look at what you would do once you get to Santa Fe. But let's take a look at another scenario. So scenario number 2 is ATC gave me a radar vector, Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta, fly heading 350, vectors for Lufsee. So I'm cruising out on a heading of 350 and climbing, they say climb maintain 8,000. Okay, so that was part of my clearance. So I'm 8,000, getting vectored to the north for Lufsee, and here somewhere over the Boulder Airport, my radio's fry and I can't reach anybody. What am I going to do then? Well, what am I being vectored for? The vectors are for Lufsee. So what's the rule say? If being radar vectored, proceed direct to the fixed route airway that they were vectoring you for. So now I'm going to turn and proceed direct to Lufsee. Okay? I would quickly take a look and see what the minimum en route off-route altitude would be. Okay? From there, I also know that I've been given, if you were to look at that clearance, expect 16,010 minutes after departure. So once 10 minutes passes, I'm going to start my climb up to 16,000 feet. Once I reach Lufsee, I'm going to continue to follow my filed route until I get to my destination. Okay, or most likely into VMC. Okay, so let's take a look at another example. And this one, we'll keep it really simple. Actually, we'll make this actually a little bit more complicated. Let's say they vector us out to the north past Longmont here. Okay, let's see, I got a couple extra points in there. So in my clearance, it said expect 16,010 minutes after departure. I depart Rocky Mountain Metro. I'm flying for 12 minutes, and then my radios fry. I know this because I'm hearing them. Everything's going great. 12 minutes later, I can't hear anything. Okay, now what am I going to do? What about that expect altitude? So this is a question that can trip people up when you're kind of getting into the lost comm regs. Once the time or point passes, the expect altitude is no longer valid. So if they were to say, expect 16,000 in 10 minutes after departure, and I've departed and it's been 10 minutes, I still have radio communication, I can hear ATC, I'm hearing them talk. It's been 10 minutes and I have not been given that higher altitude, the expect altitude is gone. So if I was to lose comm after that point, I would not climb to 16,000 feet. I would climb to the highest. They haven't given me a new expect altitude. They gave me 8,000 feet. That's my assigned altitude. So then I would quickly check the map, and I could use ForeFlight to check the direct route from there to Lufsea, and I would add 2,000 feet to that highest point. That now is my MEA. I'm going to climb up to that MEA, and then from there, I'm going to go back. Once I'm at Lufsea, let's say I was at 9,000 feet to stay above any, 2,000 feet above any obstacles here. Then from Lufsea to Adane, it's still 9,000, so I'm going to stay at 9,000. From Adane to Drake, that doesn't change, so I'm going to stay at 9,000. From Drake to Pueblo, my new MEA is 7,600 feet. My last issued was 8,000. So this is where the reg gets a little bit complicated. They gave me 8,000. I climbed up higher because my off-route MEA and then my consecutive MEAs were above 8,000 feet. Once I get to this segment between Drake and Pueblo, technically I would descend down to 7,600 feet. I would descend back down to 8,000 feet. I didn't mean 7.6. I descend back down to 8,000. And that's because 8,000 is the highest of my assigned. Remember, my expected was gone. I flew past that time. Or my minimum. And then as I cross Pueblo, my MEA changes to 8,700 feet. So I would climb up to 8,700 feet. As I cross Gossip, my MEA changes to 11,000 feet. So common question would be, would I start the climb to cross Gossip at 11,000 feet or at the minimum crossing altitude? And no, the minimum crossing altitude only applies for Victor 83. So once I cross Gossip, then I would start my climb to 11,000 feet. Then once I get to Cimarron, now I'm on that off-route segment, which requires 15,100 feet. So I would start my climb there. Here's where you would have to do some calculation. You would need to make sure that you can make the climb from 11,000 feet to 15,000 feet and ensure your terrain safety. So you wouldn't want to blindly cross Cimarron, turn to point at the mountains, and then start your climb once you pass there. You'd want to make sure you have the climb performance to clear the terrain. So again, this is a case where I would probably start my climb early to cross Cimarron at 15,100 feet, crossing over the mountains safely, and then get down to Santa Fe. So there's something, looks like we've got a question. We'll take that first.
Actually, we do, and it's pretty good timing here. The question is this. On this route, and specifically as you're getting close to Cimarron, Alex, the question is, why climb to 16,000 or 15,000 or however high you're going here versus landing at Las Vegas? Get out of the system faster. Don't go over the big mountains. Okay,
that's a great point. And exactly what I was going to talk about here with, if you look at what's going on in this flight, okay, we're lost comm, we're climbing up, then descending back down, then climbing up, then descending back down, and then we've got to climb over 15,000-foot mountains in a rugged mountain range and cross over to Santa Fe. So the first question I would ask is, I've been out of comm for how long? This is a 2-hour flight. I have no necessary, I'm missing information. I don't know what's wrong with my airplane. The question is, would I continue this flight all the way down to Santa Fe? Absolutely not. Would I cross the mountains, lost comm, going into Santa Fe? Absolutely not. There's no way you could tell me climbing up to 15,000 feet, going over the mountains and coming down, that would be the safest alternative. The reason we go through it is so that you understand the reg. And if you're taking a check ride, there's always a chance the examiner would say, I really think you've got some good decision-making skills, but tell me what altitude you should maintain. I want to make sure you understand the reg. So that's why we kind of take it through. To be completely honest, I would not land at Cimarron. If I was lost comm and I had lost comm that early, I would land at Pueblo. Again, part of the reason I would land at Pueblo is it is clearly along my route, and it allows me to easily transition to an instrument approach. And if I know the weather is good, I think it is a lot safer to put the airplane down at Pueblo and to get out of the ATC system than it would be for me to continue all the way down. And actually, Cimarron, I don't know if you've been out there, there's really nothing out here. I mean, you're out in the middle of the high desert at this point in time. So the reason I would take somewhere like Pueblo is because I know it's a towered airport. I know there's maintenance and emergency services on the ground. I know they have an ILS. They have a lot of approaches that can get me down out of the soup. The last thing I want to do is do a lost comm missed approach. So I'm going to take the approach that can get me down to the lowest minimums, especially considering if I'm lost comm, chances are I also don't have weather information. I don't know exactly where those cloud bases are. So again, in my case, now I'm thinking exactly like you. Going up and down and up and down and up and down, is that the safest way to go? And then blasting across the mountains? No. And again, if you talk to a lot of air traffic controllers, the reality is you're going to hear, we would prefer it if you get out of our system as soon as possible and safely on the ground. That's going to be the safest scenario. But again, keep in mind, on your check ride, if you're getting ready for an instrument rating check ride, they want to hear that judgment, but they also want you to be able to explain the FAR. And that means that if your assigned altitude is below an MEA, you'll go up to that next MEA. As you cross over a fix, if that MEA drops down, if it drops down below your last assigned altitude, you'll level out at your last assigned altitude. The altitudes that you fly are meant to be segment specific. The aim is very clear about that. So again, it's a common check ride question, both for an instrument student and for a CFII. Okay, we got another question.
Next question is this. Assuming a radio or electrical failure in VFR, does ATC prefer you to land at an uncontrolled or non-towered field if one is near?
Honestly, I'm going to take the safest option there. If you circle outside and wait for flashing lights and you know you can do so safely, ATC doesn't have any issue with you landing at a towered field. If the non-towered field doesn't provide any services, if there's no way to get a phone or a cab or maintenance or anything like that, that could make it a lot more difficult. And so you need to use your judgment. With Denver International, like Cessna, a Cirrus like us, flying in with no radio, or NORDO as they call it, no, especially on a VFR flight plan. They wouldn't. They don't even know to look for us. We'd really disrupt the flow. If you're outside of Rocky Mountain Metro, you realized your radio had failed, and you put yourself in a circular pattern, and you looked at the tower for light gun signals, and you saw them, no issues there. But if you feel it's safer to divert somewhere like maybe Boulder or Fort Collins, that might work too. There's one thing to keep in mind, and that is I have seen many non-towered airports that are busier than towered airports. If you fly around Colorado, Rocky Mountain Metro is very busy, but they also have air traffic controllers to keep track of everybody. When you go to Fort Collins, which is now Northern Colorado, they renamed it. Regional. Yeah. It's got a great name. Same old airport, new great name. But if you go there, there's a ton of training, and it's non-towered. It's pilot controlled. So the risk you run there is no one knows you're coming in, because the pilots aren't looking out for you the way air traffic controllers are. Air traffic controllers might see, like in Rocky Mountain Metro's tower, they may see your return on their radar screen, at least your primary. So they know you're coming in. And so in that case, they may get other aircraft out of the way so you can safely land, whereas landing at a very busy non-towered airport, no one really knows to look for you. You could cut someone off in the pattern, or someone could cut you off, and you could end up in an accident there. Again, I think really what it comes down to is in a lot of these cases, you really just need to use your judgment. And keep in mind, it's not about irritating ATC. ATC oftentimes would prefer to work to help you out so that you can do things safely. And ATC can coordinate with other airplanes. So again, it's not that we're afraid to burden ATC. It's the question is in our scenario, can ATC safely help us out and provide a better option than maybe landing somewhere where we don't have ATC? Okay, from here, I want to talk a little bit about what happens once we get to our clearance limit. Okay, so we said we were going direct to Santa Fe. And the question came up, should I file to an initial approach fix? Should I file to a common nav aid that has feeder routes to many different procedures? Should I file to the airport waypoint? And the question is, it's really up to you. First of all, filing to initial approach fix on a short route segment is fine. If I was going on a 40-mile leg, maybe filing to the IAF knowing I'm going to need one on an instrument day really actually simplifies things for me. And so in that case, there's nothing wrong with it, and it actually makes the flight a little bit easier, especially if I know that's the procedure in use at the airport. But let's say I'm flying from Carbon County in the middle of Utah all the way down to San Carlos. Filing to an initial approach fix really doesn't help anybody because A, I don't necessarily know which procedure is in use. They really only have one, but let's say it's a larger airport with multiple. And the reality is ATC is going to amend that route right away anyways, because it's probably going to take me through a whole bunch of busy airspace and they're going to send me around to somewhere else. And so again, it doesn't make a difference really, I think, where you file to. It's knowing what to do if you get there in a lost comm scenario. Okay, so let's take a look. You can see here if I file directly to KSAF or if I was given direct destination, so now I'm flying direct to KSAF, Santa Fe, and I lose my radios, what would I do? Well, when I arrive at Santa Fe, it's an airport reference point, so there are no procedures that begin there. So then I would proceed from there to a point from which I can begin a procedure. And again, my general rule is I'm going to try to take the procedure that will get me to the lowest altitude, considering the prevailing winds. And so in most cases at Santa Fe, that's going to be the ILS or localizer to runway 2. That brings me down to 200 feet above the touchdown zone elevation. So that's generally going to be my best option unless the tailwind is too strong for me to land there. So how would I get there? And the answer is I'm sitting here at the airport. You can see the runways at Santa Fe right here. Okay. We'll draw this route out. I would choose the initial approach fix that I feel gives me the easiest option to complete the procedure. In this case for me, I don't mind flying arcs. They give me some room to descend. So I would just proceed direct from the airport to this initial approach fix here, HEGME. And there are actually two different options. If you take a look, there's an option over here as well. That's Icisia. Either one of those two would provide me an arc. One might be better than the other. So here's the question. When can you start your descent? You should start your descent or your descent and approach at your estimated time of arrival, or if ATC had cleared you to the point at your EFC time. And so I'm going to arrive possibly over my initial approach picks at 15,000 feet. Okay, so the question now is, am I going to be able to get down from 15 or 16,000 feet to the initial segment of the approach's minimum altitude along that initial segment? And the reality is, in mountainous terrain, oftentimes, or if you're on a long cross-country flight, oftentimes no. There's no way to get your airplane down from your en route altitude and then safely reach the minimum altitude on the initial approach segment. And if you can't do that along that initial approach segment, and you end up high in the approach, you may never be able to successfully complete the approach. So it leaves us with a couple of options. Option number one is actually fairly simple, and that would be to look at the minimum altitude in the area. Okay, add 2,000 feet in or the highest obstacle, maybe in about a 5 or 6 mile circle around that initial approach fix. Add 1,000 in non-mountainous or 2,000 in mountainous. See if that initial approach altitude is above that. If it is, use that altitude, and then enter a 1-minute holding pattern and descend down. You can basically make up a 1-minute holding pattern and allow yourself to get down to an altitude where you can suitably reach that initial approach segment's minimum altitude somewhere along the initial approach segment. The other option would be to choose the longer initial approach segment. So let's take a look at this. HEGME is a fairly short arc, and if you look at Icisia, it's a significantly longer arc. So the reality is, if I'm at 16,000 feet, I may choose Icisia and try to descend along this long arc so that I reach 10,400 feet somewhere along the arc. Okay? If that wasn't an option, I could enter a holding pattern at Assisia, or I could choose Hegme and enter a holding pattern there, descend down to an altitude where I could then safely reach the minimum approach altitude along the arc, and then I would continue to fly the approach inbound. And the reason I bring this up is because when we talk about lost comm, if you read the instructions, okay, they essentially say you need to stay at that last altitude, which could be very, very high, and start the descent at a fix from which the approach begins. There's no way that you're going to make it down from 16,000 feet to 10,000 feet on a 25-degree arc segment. It's not safe. There's no way it's going to happen. And so in this case, as a pilot, you end up having to use a little bit of your own judgment to decide how to safely descend. And one way could be to look at a buffer zone, build up an MEA, see if that initial segment is higher than that MEA. And if it is, descend down maybe to the initial segment's altitude or several thousand feet above it so that you know you can safely descend along the approach to meet that segment and fly the procedure in. Again, when we start talking about RNAV operations, there oftentimes isn't a published segment from our clearance limit, maybe the Santa Fe airport, to an initial approach fix. So we need to define our own minimum en route altitude. And the way we do that is the same way you would define any other off-published route MEA. That is looking at a 4-mile corridor width either side, 8 nautical miles total, find the highest obstacle on that route segment at 1,000 feet in non-mountainous terrain or 2,000 feet in mountainous terrain. That becomes your new minimum en route altitude. Okay, so when we talk about the question, is it safer to file to an IAF, to a fix where there are lots of feeder routes, or to the airport reference point? The answer is you can do either. The question is, if you go lost comm on that arrival, what are you going to do? Have a plan. Know how you would calculate your minimum en route altitudes if there isn't a feeder fix or a safe way to get to the initial approach fix. And have a plan to safely descend the airplane once you reach that initial approach fix so that you can successfully fly the approach. Keep in mind, almost all of these lost comm scenarios we go through are fairly theoretical. But if it ever really does happen, you'll find oftentimes the most difficult thing is figuring out how you're going to get down from your en route altitude to an initial approach fix altitude. Okay, let's take this on one more example. I'm going to pop up the Tishner 4 arrival in Denver. So if you're studying for interview at an airline, if you're looking at getting a job as a transport category pilot, whether it's in turboprops or in turbines with an airline or charter, you're going to see a lot of these. These are stars. And it's important to remember on stars, you're going to receive quite a few things, or you're going to see quite a few altitudes. So in this case, you can see, I'll switch over to, we have these crossing restrictions in altitudes if we're assigned a descend via. Here we have a speed restriction. That'll happen anytime that we're assigned to this route. So if we're cleared for the Tishner 4 arrival, that 250 knots at RAMS is mandatory. The altitude block of 17,000 to 19,000 or flight level 190 is a descend via clearance. Then at Be Safe below 16,000. Okay, each one of these restrictions, the altitudes would be a descend via restriction. The speeds are a mandatory restriction anytime you're cleared for the arrival. Then you'll notice we have an expect here. This confuses people. Expects on stars are not the same thing as expects issued by ATC. So if you see an expect on a standard terminal arrival, it says expect 17,000 for turbines, 15,000 for pistons. That isn't a lost common expect unless ATC issues it to you as an expect. Okay, so for example, here it says expect ILS or visual approaches assigned by ATC. You would only expect that if ATC said somewhere along the route, Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta, cross RAMS at 230, expect the ILS to 35 right. Okay, now that is an actual expect. That's really important to keep in mind. It's a trick, not a trick question, but it's a question that trips people up on interviews. Published expects on arrivals are not for use in lost comm. They're simply given to you for planning purposes. So you know what to kind of plan for as you're flying the procedure. However, what people oftentimes miss is there's a lost comms box there. And we're using Jeppesen because if you're taking an airline interview, chances are you're going to see this on a Jeppesen chart. And this is really important because this is going to tell you what to do. And if you look at it here, it says, in the event of lost communications prior to runway assignment, if we're landing at Denver International, most likely on the Tishner if you're an airline coming in, execute the ILS 16 right approach. So if we look at this, what you'll actually see, I believe the last fix here, Tishner, actually feeds directly into the 16 right approach. So you would essentially fly that arrival and join up with the ILS to 16 right. So this brings up the final question that you might get in an airline interview. And that is, you never go to the lower altitude. You're always at the highest of your assigned, your expected, or the MEA. So if you were to lose communication at the very beginning of this arrival over Cherokee, out here, and you're at flight level 330, and they haven't even given you a descend via yet. They've simply said, Envoy 5256, direct Cherokee, join the Tishner, or direct Cherokee, maintain flight level 250, join the Tishner 3 arrival. That's all they say, okay? Are you going to stay at 33,000 feet all the way down this arrival until you arrive at Tishner, which is a fix, I believe, from which an approach begins, and then try to descend that jet all the way down to 33,000 feet from there to the initial approach fix altitude? And the answer is no. And the reason you wouldn't do it is because it isn't safe. There's no safe way that you're going to sit there in a holding pattern for 30 minutes surrounded by other aircraft descending down over that arrival. In this case, I think under 91.3, the safest thing to do, and an aircraft cleared for this, first of all, if you're in a transport category turbine cleared for this arrival and you have a full radio failure, you've got some serious issues. Right there, we consider it emergency. What I would do is descend via the arrival and follow the lost comms box. That's most likely what ATC will expect you to do as well. And I would do that because I would consider I'm in an emergency and I do not have a safe way to make it down from my en route altitude down to the approach altitude while holding over Tishner right in the terminal area. Okay, looks like we've got one more question.
Okay, Juan wants to know, with respect to the Tishner 3 arrival, what if the wind doesn't allow you to land at the runway specified in the lost comm section of the arrival chart?
Good question. ATC has already thought of that. Essentially, the arrivals are used based off landing north or landing south, landing east or landing west. So if the wind, when you're assigned an arrival, it means that the wind at that time is favoring the runway that you'll see in the lost comm section. And the reality is, unless there's a massive wind shift, most aircraft would be able to successfully fly that approach. If the wind was coming from a different direction, you would be assigned a different arrival. The reality, though, is, let's say it was to change significantly, and you're sitting there at Tishner going, yeah, there's no safe way I can fly this. The reality is, at that point in time, at 91.3, you would proceed from there to an appropriate approach that you could safely fly and proceed directly to that initial approach fix and execute the procedure. And the reality is, ATC would know that's an issue because it wouldn't just be an issue for you. It would now be an issue for every aircraft on the arrival. So they would be looking to see where you're going to go. Okay, last thing. In reality, a lot of this is understanding the regs. And you're never going to use these regs from start to finish on a lost comm flight. Okay? The reality is you're going to break into VMC or you're going to exercise 91.3 and conclude the flight safely at some point in time along the route. But while you're navigating the route, these regs provide guidance. Essentially, they're saying, hey, until you need to deviate from them for safe flight, this is what you should do. And that's why it's important to know them. But it's also important to know this. If you can't reach ATC, it's not necessarily lost comm yet. Number one, if you just did a frequency change, you could possibly be below their transmitter's reception. You can turn on the squelch. You can switch back to the previous controller. If I try to reach a controller and I don't hear back within about 2 or 3 minutes, I switch back to the previous controller. Keep in mind, you can call out on that frequency for other aircraft, especially when you're talking to center. Typically, there are other aircraft that can hear you and relay. You can call out on guard 121.5. Typically, airliners are monitoring guard. We call it the emergency frequency, but most pilots call it guard. It's a frequency that you can use if you're lost comm, if you can't reach someone. And in fact, if you monitor guard, you'll oftentimes hear air traffic controllers trying to reach airliners over guard that might have flown out or switched to the wrong frequency. So you'll hear them call, United 2325, Denver Center on guard, contact me on. They're trying to reach people there. So you should be trying that. If your comm radios are dead, you should be listening to your nav radios. That means usually turning off the automatic ID function so you can hear the full beeping of the navigation radio, but find the VOR facility, or if there isn't a VOR facility, you can receive maybe a localizer, the closest nav aid facility, and listen over it. If you've got 2 nav radios, listen to multiple nav facilities. In many cases, ATC can transmit over a nav facility, and they can give you instructions that you could then acknowledge by identing or some other advice. And finally, the reality is we all have cell phones. And in most cases, when you're several thousand feet above the ground, those cell phones work. So one of the things to think about is if the MEA permits it and you can't safely complete the flight at altitude, descending down into cell reception or trying on a cell phone to reach ATC is a much better way to conclude a flight than it is to fly for 4 hours completely out of communication when weather can change and stuff like that. So what you want to do is think about all the resources you have and how you would safely use them, how you can communicate with ATC, know to monitor nav aids, know to try on guard, know to try flight service stations, know to try the previous frequency. Obviously, if your radios have gone black, there's nothing left to try. Know you've got a cell phone. And then from there, use the regs to follow until you reach a point where it really would be safer for me to do this. And then you have 91.3. Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Actually, I'm going to hop on here. We actually have
more than one question.
We have a lot of questions, but
I'm going to go horse.
Most of them are referring back to the original flight, the Metro to Santa Fe flight. I just want to make sure you don't have anything else you want to talk about with this star before we hop into these questions.
No, I think we're started out on that.
Okay, all right. So starting off with Joel, then we're just going to work down the list and see if we can get through. I don't know if we can get through all of them, but we'll get through as many as we can.
Sure.
Joel wants to know this. Why not use the AROCA from the IFR low altitude and route chart instead of trying to figure out the altitudes yourself?
You absolutely can. And using the AROCA would also give you, that would be a fine way to do it. And it ultimately, part of the reason I like to show people a sectional chart is because oftentimes you can get yourself to lower altitudes if you do some planning using a sectional chart. That can be important in mountainous terrain because those grids are fairly large and mountains tend to be fairly small. They're tall, but they're small. So AROCAs are another fantastic way to do that. But the reality is if you find that leaves you very high, maybe above your aircraft's capabilities or above what you want to climb, going to your sectional chart and limiting it to a 4 nautical mile corridor might get you to a lower altitude, which might be easier to reach a procedure on or maybe better within your aircraft's performance capabilities. That's why I do that. But either one is totally fine. Either one's a good solution. Okay, next question.
Next up, the question is this. From my experience, the clearance limit is always the destination airport. I can't think of a time when it wasn't or wouldn't be unless you file to a fix. Thoughts? And Alex, this is probably a good time to talk about that flight that we saw going out to the East Coast where they cleared them to about halfway. Yeah. Milwaukee, I think.
That's a great question. And typically in light aircraft, we're going to be cleared all the way to the destination. Rarely would they clear us to an intermediate fix. But if for some reason, traffic, flow congestion, ATC issues, something in the destination airport or an area prevents ATC from clearing you through, essentially they can't handle your aircraft. ATC may ground stop you, but if they expect that situation to clear up before you arrive at some fix down your route, they may clear you to an intermediate fix. So let's say you were going from Rocky Mountain Metro to New Jersey, and your route had you going over Milwaukee. And the reason I bring this up is we heard this as an example. It was a charter, Falcon, something, something, something. You are cleared to Milwaukee via the Planes 1 departure, fix. Expect further clearance at, and then they gave them the EFC time, delays in the Trenton area. And so essentially, and then they kind of talked to him about it a little bit. They're like, yeah, we think we can get you a clearance in the middle, but there's delays in the area. That should resolve along your route. So essentially what's happened is you've been cleared to Milwaukee, a radio nav aid along your route, and no further, okay? And they've given you an EFC time to expect your clearance on from Milwaukee. And they're doing that because they don't really think they need to ground stop you. They think that by the time you get to Milwaukee, they'll be able to clear you in without a delay. And so they're just going to get you up in the air and get you moving. And then once that delay or whatever it is, congestion in the area, ATC restriction, it could be a facility radar outage. It could be all kinds of stuff. Once that's resolved, then they'll clear you the rest of the way. That's typically when your clearance limit will not be your destination. Now, obviously, you could file an IFR VFR plan, and you could have a clearance limit, that isn't an airport. And in that situation, that would be, your planned route. So it shouldn't come as a surprise. But typically when you get cleared somewhere other than your destination, it's because ATC expects whatever problem there is at the destination or en route to clear up while you're en route. So they're just going to get you up in the air, and then they'll clear you along the way once that fixes. Okay, next question.
Next up, the question is this: what telephone number would I use to try ATC with my cell phone if I lost comms?
That's a great question. The FAA publishes so first of all, if you don't, you could look at, there's air traffic control numbers published in the chart supplement. So you could absolutely look at the chart supplement and start digging through air traffic control facility numbers in there. That's a great way to go. But sometimes you may not have that documentation available in flight. And some people carry the air traffic control facility numbers printed on a PDF, part of their electronic flight kit. You could find it there. So I said chart supplement, maybe they carry the PDF. The other thing to keep in mind in the chart supplement now, next to non-towered airports, is a phone number you can call for clearance delivery. So while that might not be the appropriate phone number for the facility, it is a phone number that will get you to a controller. And that controller can get you to a phone number that you should talk to or can relay to you. So that's a good option. Finally, one of the best is you can always call the National Clearance Delivery Hotline, or you can call a flight service station, 1-800-WX-BRIEF, and they can find a phone number for you for air traffic control. That being said, what I found is in general, if you can talk to the facility who you're flying through, if you can talk to Denver Center, that is always the easiest. And so if you're lost comm and you don't have a directory or phone numbers and you can't find them in the back of the chart supplement, you just need to get a hold of someone quickly. You could pull up a non-towered airport and its AFD page in ForeFlight and see if they have a clearance delivery phone number. Call that and ask the controller. You could always call 1-800-WX-BRIEF or the National Clearance Delivery Hotline and just say, hey, I am lost comm over this area. Do you have a phone number for this facility? And that, at the end of the day, this is a fairly rare occurrence. If you don't have the phone number for the facility, don't feel like you've done anything wrong. Just find a resource, use that to get you to the correct facility. Okay, next question.
Next up, Juan wants to know this. Let's say ATC just gave you a vector instruction. However, before you could read it back, you lose your comms. Will they expect you to fly directly to the point where they were vectoring you to?
They most likely would hope for you to. So if you heard it and you heard it correctly, I would go there, even though you haven't confirmed it. And the reality is because that's where ATC wanted you to go. That's why they gave it to you. If it sounded like they gave you an altitude that you didn't hear, then I would make sure that you can get to a high enough altitude to safely make it there. But the reality is, if ATC said something like, Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta, turn right heading 120 vectors for left C, and I went to acknowledge it, and my radios went dead, I'm going to consider that I have the ATC instruction, and I'm going to follow that vector to left C. Next question.
Okay, we got a few more here. We'll keep moving through them and see how far we can get. Next question is this. What if you don't see light gun signals at a tower-controlled airport?
They can be kind of hard to see, especially in the middle of the day. A little bit easier at night, but especially in the middle of the day. And the answer is you need to now use your judgment. If you don't see anything coming from the tower cab, chances are they're beaming the light at you. It's just that you don't notice it. And by the way, if you've never received light gun signals before, you absolutely should. And not just once. You know, controllers don't mind pulling that out. It's something they practice using as well. And they've got it right there. It's not like they got to go dig it out of a room. They've got a light gun right in the cab. So it is something that you should look at several times, periodically, to make sure you're familiar with what one of them looks like. But if you're not seeing anything from the tower cab, you know, you're not seeing reds, you're not seeing greens, you're not seeing anything, what I would do at that point in time is watch the flow of traffic entering the airport and then safely join the pattern and land on the runway in use. Chances are ATC is flashing the lights at you. And again, you know, use your discretion. That's what I would do. But if you feel uncomfortable landing there and you're not seeing anything from the tower cab and you can safely get the airplane to a non-towered airport and you know you could join the flow safely there as well, then, you know, that's always an option. Again, this really comes down to pilot judgment. And if you're looking to see if the FARs are going to say you're not allowed to land at that airport, you have to divert, they don't. They expect you to use your judgment there. Okay, next question.
Okay, we got time for one last question, and it comes from Michael. And he asked this back when we were talking about kind of arriving into the Santa Fe area. So this question is kind of based around getting close to an airport. And his question is this: what if you're descending to an assigned altitude and you lose radio communication? Do you continue your descent to that assigned altitude, or do you climb to the MEA if the MEA is higher, or do you maintain your filed altitude? Where are you going to go in this scenario?
Good question. Filed altitude is never actually, so we always think about it because filed route is an option, but when we talk about altitudes, filed altitude isn't an option unless it's specified in a lost comms box of a procedure. So really we're going to go to the highest of the MEA, the assigned, and if they've given you an expected altitude to expect down the road, the highest of that. If they've given you expect lower, you would never leave your assigned for the lower altitude because it's the highest of. So when you look at the regs, the highest of your assigned, your MEA, and your expected. So if they gave you an altitude that was below the route's MEA, the first thing I would look for is to see if there was a MOCA, obstruction clearance altitude, and you're within 22 nautical miles of the facility. In that case, the MOCA would be a suitable MEA, and so you could use that. And if they were descending you below the MEA in route, and first of all, the chances are they would never do that. But if they descended you below an MEA en route, then yeah, you would climb up to the MEA and go from there. Keep in mind, when we talk about MEAs along airways are there to provide both clearance of terrain and radio reception. If you're operating in GPS, you do not need the nav aid reception of the ground nav aids. You just need the terrain clearance. And you may find that it is safer to be lower. And there could be a couple reasons for that. Number one, higher could mean icing. Higher could mean all kinds of things. And so you may find that it is safer to be lower. And if you're GPS equipped and can fly along the MOCA just fine, that might be, in some cases, a safer option for you. So it is a suitable MEA within 22 nautical miles. And again, that limitation is just so that you can still receive the ground-based nav aid. But if you're using GPS to navigate the route and you feel that going up to the published MEA is not as safe as staying at the MOCA would be, then the MOCA may be a better altitude for you. Okay, we'll do this again in the future as well. Lost comms is something that we can talk about almost endlessly. And again, keep this in mind. You need to understand the regs. You need to understand the fact that altitudes are segment dependent, that you will change altitudes on segment based on that highest of. You need to understand, the routing concept and to look for lost comm boxes on arrivals and departure procedures. so that you know what ATC expects of you. But then also keep in mind on your check ride, your examiner is looking for judgment. And if you don't feel it safe, or you consider it to be an emergency situation, you can deviate from the lost comm regs to get the airplane on the ground. And again, in most cases, that's what air traffic control is hoping. If they're watching you, they do want you on the ground as soon as possible. Okay, we got some links in the bottom tonight. One of them, Colin, how about you tell us about those links?
Okay, the first link is to our courses. If you like this, go ahead and check out our courses. We've got 4 great ones out there and more on the way. And the second one is our feedback. If you have any more ideas on topics you'd like us to talk about, go ahead and click that link, fill out the form, tell us what we should talk about in the next Bold Method Live, and we will put it on the list.
Awesome. And we hope to see you in 2 weeks. We'll be doing VFR and IFR again. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great night.